Hello, everyone in the audience. On behalf of the Department of Art, History, and Music at Fordham University, I'd like to welcome everyone to the second panel in our series, Black Voices, Classical Music. We'll be speaking with distinguished guests about questions of Black representation in so-called classical music. My name is Matthew Gelbart. I'm the chair of the Fordham Art, History, and Music Department. I'm a musicologist. My research involves questions of how we categorize music into genres stylistically and ideologically. But I'm joined with my co-moderators today, my colleagues Angelina Tallaj, who is an ethnomusicologist whose work focuses on identity and Dominican music, both in the Dominican Republic and the Dominican diaspora, especially in New York, and Marlon Daniel, who conducts our Fordham orchestras on both of our Fordham campuses. So before we proceed, I would like once again to offer some important thanks. There are several people without whose support and work this event would not be possible. The academic and campus deans of Fordham, Eva Badowska, Laura Aricchio, and Maura Mast have provided generous financial support for the series. We're also grateful to the Department of African and African American Studies at Fordham for their co-sponsorship and support. Our department administrator, Angela Mikulski, our digital resources curator and coordinator, Katharina Fastano, and our performance and space coordinator, Grant Smith, have all worked hard helping to organize and publicize the series and keep things going technologically, and we're incredibly grateful to all of them. And now on to our panelists. I'm going to introduce them alphabetically. So I'm start with Naomi André, who is professor in the Department of Afroamerican and African Studies, Women's and Gender Studies, and the Residential College at the University of Michigan. Her 2018 book, Black Opera, History, Power, and Engagement from the University of Illinois Press, won the Lowens Book Award from the Society for American Music and the Judy Tho Critical Race Studies Award from the American Musicological Society. Her other books include Voicing Gender, Castrati, Travesty, and the Second Woman in early 19th century Italian opera, and the co-edited collection Blackness in Opera from 2012. Currently, she's a co-editor for the essay collection African Performance Arts and Political Acts. She's also the inaugural scholar in residence at the Seattle Opera and a founding member of the Black Opera Research Network. And on a personal note, I would like to add she was the graduate TA and the wonderful discussion section leader for one of my very first music classes as an undergrad. So it's great to have Naomi back here. Steve Swayne is a fellow, is the Jacob H. Strauss 1922 professor of music at Dartmouth College. He has written 2 books, How Sondheim Found His Sound from the University of Michigan. We've got a real University of Michigan thing going here today. And Orpheus in Manhattan, William Schumann and the Shaping of America's Musical Life from Oxford University Press in 2011. The latter won the 2012 Nicholas Slonimsky Award for Outstanding Musical Biography. His articles have appeared in the Sondheim Review, the Journal of the Royal Musical Association, American Music, Studies in Musical Theater, Indiana Theory Review, the Musical Quarterly, lots of places. And Steve has also served as council secretary, and he is the current president of our learned society, the American Musicological Society. And he's also an accomplished concert pianist and a fellow UC Berkeleyite. So, hi, Steve. And Kira Thurman is assistant professor of history and German studies at the University of Michigan. She is a winner of the Berlin Prize, among other awards and fellowships. She's the author of several articles on music, the Black diaspora, and German-speaking Europe, in publications including the Journal of the American Musicological Society. And her article, Black Venus, White Bayreuth, Race, Sexuality, and the Depoliticization of Wagner, won the German Studies Association DAAD Prize for Best Article on German History in 2014. Her book, Singing Like Germans, Black Musicians in the Land of Bach, Beethoven, and Brahms, is forthcoming this year with Cornell University Press, so yay.
Yay.
And on that note, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Angelina, who will start us off with the first question.
You can put your questions in the Q&A, and Matthew will moderate the Q&A at the end. So the first question for the panelists is, if you could tell us a little bit about your paths to becoming musicologists. So maybe
you can go in any order you want. You want to
How
go
about we stick with alphabetically for now? So maybe Naomi goes first, and then sorry, you're on mute.
Thank you. The person whose last name is A will never suggest that, but that's fine. I'm happy to go. I want to start with saying I anticipate, and we'll see if I'm right or wrong, but a lot of us had probably had what most people would consider surprising backgrounds for Black folks. A lot of people think that Black folks get into music by some magical, crazy, weird way, but sometimes it's actually in our families, or it's something that's not magical and crazy, but actually makes a lot of sense. So just to really quickly answer the question, my sort of the secret with me and opera is that my mother had gone to the Juilliard School, and she's still living, but she's not singing now. So she was a coloratura soprano. She didn't finish there because when her father died after her, I think in the middle of her second year, her mother thought it wasn't a good career for a young woman in the 1960s. And so she, she sort of moved into a bunch of different places. By the time I was born, she was singing in churches. And so I grew up with the sound of an operatic voice in my ear, singing lullabies, singing, in the car. She was always singing. And she also listened, and she sang Mendelssohn, Bach, Handel, so all the oratorio, religious type of things. And so you could say it's almost Lacanian that, the sound of my mother's voice was there in my ear. However, we didn't go to the opera. We didn't really have much money. And so it wasn't until I went to a fancy boarding school for high school. I went to Westtown School. I don't know if any in Southeast Pennsylvania. And they would, right outside of Philadelphia, they'd bring us into different performances in Philadelphia. And so going to see the Philadelphia Singers at that point, and the orchestra, and just classical music things was something I sort of learned the joy of live performance of classical music. When I went to undergrad in college at Barnard in New York City, one of my friends who was a year behind me in high school said, "Oh, you'll be in New York City. I have an aunt who lives there. We should go to the opera." And I said, "Oh, okay, look me up." And he did. And we ended up, that was what turned me on to opera. And I had no idea I wanted to become an opera scholar. I was singing for fun, but at that point I was more of a pianist, not really good at all. But I just went, so being exposed and immersed in it and getting to know the repertory was what did it for me.
I think you're right. Actually, we learned that from the previous panel, that a lot of the panelists had families that were already involved in classical music in various ways. So you were right.
Well, mine wasn't. So I don't know if this will be magical, but I can remember in elementary school, we had a pretty crappy pep band, and I remember writing an arrangement for Anchors Away that we never played. I did it on 3x5 cards because, that's what, I didn't know what music paper was. So when I was 11, my one of my teachers said, your son is quite musical. You ought to see if you can do something. And so my dad loved the jazz organist Jimmy Smith. And so my first lessons were on jazz organ. And so my lessons would consist of playing the piece of music in front of me, improvising and melody on top of the left hand and the bass, and then transposing. So that was, every piece I ever worked on, that's what I did, which meant that when I actually came to Cal, I can remember, Matthew, one time I had to play for a tenor, Stephen Rumpf, and it was in the wrong key, the Schubert song. It's like, well, I'll just transpose it. So I went from F to D, and it's like, And Alan Curtis is like, how do you do that? It's like, this is what I've done. So, I did that for 4 years in high
Charles
school.
Ives' dad or something.
in high school, I then heard this one person playing in the band practice room for Eliza. And I thought, that is the most beautiful piece I've ever heard. I think I want to learn that. And so for about a year, I was working on classical piano music on my organ, and would play piano at the studio instead of that. And so when I went to Occidental College, I had 2 years of classical piano training. And my piano teacher at the time thought that the college had made a big mistake making me a pianist, giving me money for that. And so it's like, success is always the best revenge. And so I ended up giving a sophomore, junior, senior honors recital. On the honors recital, I played Liszt's Piano Sonata. A year later, I tried to figure out, what am I going to do with the rest of my life? I should say I also graduated summa cum laude, and there's an interesting story about that. What am I going to do with the rest of my life? I applied to 2 graduate programs in musicology, got accepted at one, and decided 5 hours before the plane left not to go, in part because I was dealing with the fact that I was gay, and I didn't know what to do with that. And so what I ended up doing instead was doubling down on not being gay. I went to seminary, and I have a Master of Divinity degree, and I worked for 5 years as a chaplain of a college up in Seattle. When I was in Seattle, I was taking some post-baccalaureate classes at the University of Washington, was trying to figure out what did I need to do to get on the other side of the fence. I was on the student life side. The academic side of the world looked so much more interesting, and I was just as smart and smarter than some of the people on that other side. So I decided, well, I needed a terminal degree. Do I do it in theology or religion or music? And it's like, well, music is what people, I would play piano at chapel and people loved it. It's like, why am I fighting this? And why am I fighting being gay? And oh my gosh. Anyway, so I applied to 3 schools, Cal, Penn, Harvard. Interesting stories about each. Decided to go down to Cal because they liked the fact that I wrote a paper on Stephen Sondheim. And so that was part of the reason why that happened. But from the time I graduated to the time I started graduate school, that was 11 years. 9 years for the PhD, would have never done it. If I knew it, it would have taken that long. The only job offer I got was at Dartmouth College, and I've been here now for 22 years.
Interesting story. Wow.
Yeah, I love hearing these stories.
I would love to hear the long
just,
version of that.
These are great stories.
Yeah.
I know,
This
me
is
too.
Great.
Yeah. So I mean, I feel like there are 2 different questions, like, which it seems like we're answering one or both. Like, one question being like, how did you end up as perhaps a classical musician, or how did you end up in classical music? Which is just like what Naomi said, that at least for me, it's my mother loved classical music. My mother is Jamaican, born and raised in England, and then emigrated to Canada. So and grew up listening to classical music on the BBC as a young girl. So for her, she loves Baroque music in particular. I joke all the time that for her, music kind of stops in 1750 with Bach's death, and then she's not interested anymore. So definitely it was not unusual. And also I grew up in Vienna, Austria, which is like the other thing, like in the background all the time. So there's music there everywhere as well. And so it's just normal at age 8, all kids basically go hear like Mozart's Magic Flute for the first time. Like, you don't really have a choice. It's like you're like the field trip that you do when you're 8 is you go see this opera. So, and I grew up playing piano starting at age 4. I think it's a different question of like, how do you end up in musicology, which I think Steve was reminding me of, and like the process of graduate school in particular. And so I mean, for being, I guess in some ways a musicologist, I'm also not a musicologist. I'm in a history department. I'm in a German department. I did not get my PhD in musicology. So this makes me the outlier on the panel in some ways, although Naomi and I are not outliers. Steve's the outlier in that he's the only one in a music department at a music school, you know, and Naomi and I are the outsiders, you know, in these ways. So, which is also interesting, and I feel like also says something. Yeah, so actually, so I went to a conservatory of music for my bachelor. I do have my BM in music. And then But senior year, I knew I wanted to switch over to history. So I switched over to history, but was determined to keep a foot in musicology. So I took classes at Eastman and musicology classes. That's where I did my PhD, was at the University of Rochester. And so just made sure to have an active foot, I suppose, in the musicology world, which I've still maintained pretty aggressively, I guess you could say, to this day. Yeah, I'll leave it at that. That was a long answer.
Great. Thank you. And if we want, we can go reverse alphabetically for the next question.
Sure.
Kick it off so that Naomi gets a break.
Or we could start with Steve, because poor Kira just thought.
Okay, fine. We'll start with Steve.
You can go first.
But so this is a sort of a multi-part question, which might lead us in different directions. But your research really varies between you, from person to person, from year to year within your own work. From studying, say, music by Black composers and entrepreneurs globally, to studying Black performers of music by sort of white German famous musicians, to studying famous American Jewish musicians. Have you had experiences where people have suggested what music you, quote, should or should not study? I'm sure you all have, but what kinds of experiences were those, because of your race, both within and outside the academy? And how do you think about questions of your sort of placement as a scholar, and that a white scholar studying Black music, white music, relative, in general, about questions of placement relative to the music that we study?
Okay, so I grew up in Los Angeles and Pasadena, California. You look at the history of the school district was desegregated in 1970. That was my 9th grade year. So my own understanding of who I was and what scholarship was, I was always around white folk, but I was also around Latinx and Japanese back in California at that time, Japanese. So my world has always, at least in my way of looking at it, has been fairly racially mixed. So it didn't occur to me that I shouldn't play or study any particular kind of music. It was all out there. And so it's like, this is the stuff I enjoyed. And I can't think of once in college that I was ever confronted with, why are you playing this kind of music? Again, success is the best revenge. If I'm playing the Prokofiev Third Sonata, and you can't, case closed, And so there were moments though, and it kind of weird moments, because I did know how to improvise. It's like, why aren't you doing more jazz? It's like, well, I play private parties. I can do that. And I got up to where I was making $100, $150 an hour. So I know how to do that. But it was like, that's something I just know how to do. It never felt racially coded to me. And so then when I, as Kira was saying, I kind of spilled over, how did I get into classical music? And then how did I get into musicology? I think all of us would agree we were all good students. That's part, my statement of being summa cum laude. It was, in part to best all the white kids around me who thought, oh, you're majoring in music? That's, of course, easy to do that. It's like, well, just, again, I'll succeed. It's like I'm one of 9 people who graduated from summa cum laude. And so there, now we put that to rest. I should say, all of us could say about the whole notion of, trying twice as hard to get half as far. But, some of our supererogation is just, because we're just proud and arrogant and stubborn. And so there is that. To your specific question, Matthew, the last time, the most recent time this occurred was I was at Williams College, Sondheim's alma mater, talking about a conference about Sondheim. And talking about how when he was at Williams, to borrow the tagline from one song from Cabaret, he didn't look Jewish at all. And he considered himself a Quaker. And you'd have to know that from the George School and other kinds of things. And accidentally, in asking Steve a question via email, Steve responded that, yes, he subscribed to being a Quaker. So here I'm now presenting this as, from my vantage point, pure fact. And there was an audience member whose line of questioning had an undercurrent about it, about you cannot possibly know what it's like to be a New York Jew. And I'm thinking, you're right. So what's your question? Because I'm just dealing with the fact that this is what Stephen Sondheim had to say. And I'm dealing with the fact that this is what his colleagues had to say between 1946 and 1950. And maybe we should deal with the fact that you don't seem to accept the fact that I can work on this stuff, because that may be the issue we need to talk about. And so generally speaking, I've never stopped, what does it mean for a Black Angelino gay pianist to work on New York Jews? One of the things it means is that I ask questions that other people probably don't think of asking. And so when I asked William Schumann's son, did he have a bris? Of course, he didn't know. And it's like, well, it seems like that, but it tells me something about that whole community, and German Jews versus Russian Jews, and Aaron Copland versus William Schumann was, from Germanic stock, and so it's like, man, I learned, a lot more, and emic etic, the idea that I was an outsider, and I had all these interesting questions that my book probably shows that I'm in one sense an outsider, but also I have certain issues. And so the very opening gesture in my book on William Schumann talks about civil rights and where Schumann fit into that, and James Meredith and how his Eighth Symphony fit in with this guy from the NAACP writing him his letter. I shouldn't say I guarantee you, but few other scholars would have started a book on William Schumann that way. And so there are things that I do that are informed by who I am. And I would hope, and this, I'm glad, Kira, you get to go next. I would hope that those folks who say, I don't know if you belong to talk about this work, it's like, but I bring language and ideas to this that you have not even begun to think about. And so I'm enriching the field, and you should be grateful that I'm here. Kira, over to you.
Okay, sure. That's a great note to end on, though, that we are enriching the field and that people should be grateful for us. Yeah, I mean, that, there are all of these ways in which, of course, I have dealt with this question of like what I'm researching and why I'm researching it. And, and that there are so many ways, of course, in which like I have been made to feel like I don't belong, right? And this comes from many different angles and many different fronts. That I work on German history in particular, right? I work on Black Germans, and Black German studies, which is its own thing. And then people are like, what's that? I don't know what that is, and so then I have to explain like the long history of Black people in Germany, and that there is like an Afro-German population, and like, so it comes at you from every single which way, but then I think probably what you're going to hear from all three of us is like a stubborn persistence, right? Of just being like, well, I'm just going to do it anyway, right? Which I think you kind of need in order to survive in academia. Which has come. I think I'm struggling to, and I'll admit it, I'm struggling to like talk about some of this stuff, and I looked at the questions in advance, in part because I don't necessarily just want to like perform my pain all the time, nor do I feel like I want to like be put on the spot to like have that role of like, how hard has it been for you, Kira, right? When like I do want to, of course, recognize inequities in musicology and things like that, but I would also say that I think maybe the more interesting question for all of us would be to figure out like, how did we succeed? Right? Like, how did we do it? How did we decide to pursue what we needed to pursue? And what strengths did we bring to the table? What were some moments where it became clear to us that we were good at this, and that we had really interesting things to say, and that we recognized the novelty and uniqueness and specialness of like our different projects, whatever they are, whether or not they have to do with race and ethnicity. Yeah.
It's so wonderful to hear everyone talk about these things, because we all have similar experiences, but sort of in different time periods or in different ways. And Kira, I really appreciate your saying, sort of talking about the moment we're in. These past several months have been the first time people have really been interested in asking me sort of, what has your experience been like? and listening to it. And, some of my friends have asked privately, but in terms of a public statement, and it's a tough call to talk about things that are so personal and can be damaging. And also, Steve, I like your point about the best revenge is success, because I had no idea when I had so many troubles early in my career that I would even be able to stay as a musicologist and stay employed, and that I would make it. I mean, I always loved music, and I fell in love with the classical European tradition. And as I learned other types of music, I fell in love with that too. I just love listening to things, and I find them interesting, and things that I'm like, whoa, what's that? I remember the first time I heard Schoenberg as, some of the piano pieces, Opus 11, and feeling in college like, what the heck is that? And then I get to Harvard and I'm working with Reinhold Brinkmann, who's a Schoenberg specialist. And I learned to listen and hear differently. It was, so just falling in love with the sound of the music, but that doesn't answer the question. What I'm hesitating with saying, and I will say it because I am a full professor now, and I have a little more impunity than some, like Kira is still, gosh, so brave, so wonderful, all of this stuff. Although her work is just top notch, and yay, people are seeing it. But I came in wanting to be a Verdi scholar. And I didn't know I thought I wanted to do Monteverdi. And Harris Saunders was there when I was interviewing an African-American man at Harvard. And he had this big map of Venice in the 17th century in his office. And I thought, this is the person, yay, look at this. And then he wasn't there when I got there in the fall. And I'm like, where did he go?
Yeah.
And nobody talked about him. And thankfully, he is still in the field. And I want to see him more. And hopefully one day I can follow up on that. But I didn't know really what I wanted to study. Opera at that point at Harvard was very like, oh my gosh, especially 19th century opera. If you're doing, my colleagues were doing medieval and Renaissance topics. And if I were going to do a 19th century topic, I might as well have the good graces to do a German one. So the fact that I wanted to look at gender and things, this is in the early 90s when those were still brand new questions. That was like, it wasn't, why are you a Black person doing this, but like, why would you even want to do this? Why gender? What's up with that? 19th century Italian opera? What's crazy? And when I was working with Reinhold Brinkmann, he said, well, I'm horrible at trying to imitate accents, but he says, well, I don't really follow this, but I will start. And he was a wonderful advisor because he was just about asking great questions, like how to ask questions. And yeah, he was wonderful. And he's since passed on. Miss him. So, yes, I remember my first year in graduate school, Shirley Caesar was coming to campus, and somebody asked me, one of the people on the faculty asked me, oh, are you going to go hear Shirley Caesar? And I'm like, I didn't know who she was. And so then it's like, and literally this person said, but you're Black, she's a gospel singer. And I felt horrible because he didn't say, do you know Grace Bumbry, Harolyn Blackwell, Leona Mitchell, Kathleen Battle, Jessie Norman,
Simon Estes.
I had seen all of those Black women sing on the stage. I didn't just hear of them, I actually heard them. But no, there was no space for me to say that. And I heard a lot of other people because, for about 7 years, I basically saw everything in the Met's repertory multiple times because I would stand. And so I learned the canon. I was very fortunate. Now it's really hard to see opera, but the Michigan Opera Theater, I don't know if you heard, they just announced it this week. They're doing amazing things, including X, Life and Times of Malcolm X by Anthony Davis. Mm-hmm. So yes, people were shocked. And I tried to be, I will say this is one of these bold things, but I'm saying it now because I was kept out of being a Verdi scholar. I met all the gatekeepers. And it's, do I mention them? Martin Shusett, Phil Gossett, Harold Powers, they're all gone. But there was very much, I'd go talk to them, even when I had Lewis Lockwood, who had been on the faculty when Phil Gossett went to Princeton, and Lewis Lockwood was on my committee, and he sent a personal, invitation. No. They would not engage with my work. They'd write vicious, mean things when I would submit things to be published, and never would say revise and resubmit. And I didn't know, because I wasn't getting any mentoring as a junior scholar, that that's what you do. So I actually have 3 really wonderful articles about Verdi that came out of my dissertation. I didn't get to publish anything because there was a hard wall. It was not possible in their imagination for a Black young woman to be their colleague about Verdi. Sometimes people, and I don't want to go into awful names, but they'd ask me questions or say something that wasn't true. And then I wasn't sure, am I supposed to correct them because I don't want to? Because that's one thing was about Rheingold and Trovatore, and how Rheingold was the first opera to use anvils. And I had said Trovatore was. And I said, but Rheingold is from 54 and Trovatore is from 1853. And then they would just sort of ask questions, and I felt bad, when there was a wrong answer. But then I also thought, I think you're testing me. I mean, it was just vicious, nasty, brutal. And I'll say that. Yeah. So yes, absolutely. Being able to go into different, I'm only able to be an opera scholar now where people are listening because I'm writing about things that the opera clan has never wanted to look at. And so at the end of a history of opera, where the opera tradition kind of closes, I'm thrilled with that because I'm opening it up again and saying, yes, the tradition is still very alive. It's happening in Black spaces. It's happening in the US, in Europe, in South Africa, and we have so many other traditions out there. So I love opera. I talk about it. But yes, absolutely. When I was going through, and I'm in one of the early generations of Black musicologists. There are certainly a few before me in earlier generations, but I'm in an earlier stage of where we're actually beginning to get a critical mass. I wasn't allowed to do that.
Thank you. No, that's really interesting, the sort of gatekeeping of spaces and just making people feel like the space is not theirs to participate in, that you talked about is obviously something important. And I guess this is a difficult follow-up, but it raises issues of sort of the responsibilities, Kira was saying about, performing pain, right? This is balance of sort of sharing experiences with just being, but that the responsibilities, do you feel extra senses of responsibility on your, to do certain things or to speak for certain people in these situations, to open paths for other people, et cetera, as the generations change?
I mean,
you don't have to go in order.
Yeah, if I could go first, yeah, but I don't think of that as like a burden, I guess. I mean, so, I was going to write my dissertation on German Romanticism and music and nationalism in the 1830s, and then through a variety of different, basically through a class, I discovered that I could write about the history of Black people in Germany. And then I started combining it with my interest in and my training in music. And frankly, it was an exciting opportunity. I just didn't know, and this is what Naomi was saying, I just didn't know I could do this, right? And so I didn't know that because nobody had done it, it felt like a wide open playing field, and that I could, open those doors, like Naomi was saying, of like, if this is closed, I'm going to reopen them, so I still feel like it is an exciting, I never feel as if somehow I am talking about this stuff because I bear this great burden or something, nor do I feel like I'm talking about what I talk about because it's the only thing I can talk about, as if I can't converse and teach on a whole host of different things, which I do. It's more that this is what I'm excited about, and this is what I'm passionate about. And that, that I guess if I could switch out the word responsibility to opportunity, I see all kinds of different opportunities abound as well in networking with and talking to other Black musicologists, other Black classical musicians, and really sort of participating in what I feel like is a really vibrant sort of scene these days for Black classical musicians of all stripes doing whatever, so so I mean, I guess, I don't think of it as a burden or really a responsibility so much as, again, at least to my mind, it's the thing that has energized me and kept me going when other things are kind of, sometimes hard or tedious or whatever, I guess is what I would say.
Well, it's sort of interesting to me that the 2 out of 3 of you guys are very connected with your studies of Germany, and actually in German opera in particular, because, of course, I have a liking, we can say, for that, because I was in Berlin for a while. And it's just really, I thought it was just fascinating. Also, of course, I thought Steve's story was fascinating of how they've been brought to the musicology table. One thing that I would like to know, I mean, considering, the topic of our webinar, Black Voices, Classical Music, how do you guys bring to the table, I was going to say something like bring to the table narratives around classical music and actually being Black, and actually kind of infusing that into your musicology and what you teach? Because, with all these new responses or cries out about, classical music and white supremacy, in Germany, of course, knows a lot about that. So I just wonder, how do you, I know how I deal with it as a conductor, but how do you deal with it as someone in the field of academia, and of bringing it about, not only the history, but just even the theory, and how do you infuse this with your teaching, and how do you think that about inclusion in your teaching? Maybe I should ask Steve that. he looks like he's ready to answer that one.
I was, in part, I was thinking, if we're going in alphabetical order, it's name, that round robin is Naomi's turn again. It's like, Naomi, please speak. Marlon, the reason I'm just kind of feeling this way, to what degree is our being there the statement itself? Mm-hmm. So when I came to Dartmouth, my first classes were in 2000, and I walked into the room and I realized that for some of my students, I was the first African-American authority figure that they had ever been in front of, and that they would have to answer to me. And back in 2000, in the early 2000s, there were moments where that was clearly a contested thing, where this one student, a white student, challenged my ability to be fair in grading. And so I turned to my female white TA and I said, would you like to help me to respond to that? And then some of the white students came up to me afterwards and said, that guy's a jerk, you don't need to pay attention to him. Fast forward 20 plus years. Again, I grew up in segregated Southern California. So the fact that my students, white, of all colors, have no difficulty seeing me as an authority figure, I have to be honest, sometimes I have to struggle with that. It's like, what happened to the world? I'm used to having to joust around these things or having to prove myself. But my students are like, you're the authority. Why? It was kind of interesting. Those of you who frequent, and why should you, the page of the American Musicological Society may know that I just wrote a statement as president about anti-Asian violence. And I'm looking at my class, Naomi, I taught my opera class this term, and I have so many Korean and Chinese students in my class. And I'm trying to figure out, how do I communicate to them what we've all just experienced? And if you read my statement, it's basically, I share your anger because I've lived that. I know what it's like to be singled out, to be told that you don't belong, to go back to your place, to have to worry about where you show up, and to be, fearful, like fearful of going into a supermarket, all these kind of things in terms of, what the Black experience has been. And, there are times I feel like I have far more affinity with obviously my LGBTQ students, my female students who know oppression, my students of color. I don't mean to be too soppy about this, but sometimes I pity my white, straight male students, because they don't fully know how hard it is to live in this life. And so just, I don't want to over determine the fact that I stand in front of them and all of a sudden, they have a different understanding of what it means to be Black in the world. I mentioned the anti-Asian statement because I sent it to one of my Korean students, and he wrote back and he said, "Hey, it's really cool. I didn't know you were the president of the American." And so all these different ways that our students don't fully process the world that they live in and that we live in. And it's a challenge because, like one of the questions in the Q&A, how do we get Florence Price and William Grant Still, more into the performing repertoire? And it's like, well, yeah, and how would we get Amy Beach and the Wreckers? Why didn't Ethel Smith? How do we get these people into and so, the issue for me is like, how can we get more of everything in there? For me, again, I think it's just as important to have people of color in the orchestra playing, Marlon, or up front conducting, the first clarinetist of the Metropolitan Opera. I would love for, Naomi, I'm imagining this is kind of maybe where you are too, is like an entire Black opera company, performing Rigoletto, it's like, or the Kinshasa Symphony Orchestra, their performance of Beethoven's Ninth, and so there is this sense of, and this is what I tell my students, that, because this is music made by humans, this music is ours too. And so the idea that somehow it's not ours because, somebody's going to say to Kira, well, you don't know because you don't know anything about Austria. Is like, excuse me, I know more about Austria than most Austrians know about Austria because I'm on the outside and inside both. And so we have this privileged position that we need to use and say, no, I'm sorry, you're not going to exclude me. This is mine. I'm going to lay claim to it. And in laying claim to it, I lay claim to it in a specific way because of me being a Black gay man. And to celebrate that and to bring them along with the celebration. Long answer, but that's, where I would start.
Thank you so much. Sorry, I had an intrusion of a 4-year-old. I don't know how much of that was on mic. I had to remove.
Yeah.
Naomi, you haven't gotten to go for a while?
Oh, that's okay. I'm just so excited about this idea of a Black Rigoletto or Ariadne or anything like that. I wanted to approach this from a slightly different response, but I totally agree with, I just love how maybe you guys don't realize when you put this panel together, but it's really wonderful to be with other Black musicologists and hear their experiences and learn. So it's such a pleasure. So when Steve says that so much of what we do is just sort of showing up in front of the classroom and challenging people's expectations of what this knowledge is coming from that person, that's a big thing. And while our colleagues, some who are really liberal, don't want to, they don't want to see that. They want to think that, they see us as equals and so everybody does, but that's really not the case. But where I want to go with this question a little bit, and sort of the question of sort of bringing these topics into our teaching. Given my appointment, which is not in the School of Music, and I teach a lot of liberal arts students who are non-majors, and a lot of engineers and business students. And so I'm not teaching the next generation of performers, but I am teaching this generation of audience members, patrons, and board members. And so I take this as a very serious thing. Some of my classes, I have an intro to African-American intro to African-American studies, but I bring in the arts a lot in different ways. I bring in the arts around incarceration and teaching theater. We have here at Michigan a wonderful prisoner creative arts program, and Ashley Lucas just had her book come out, and she was the head of that program. And so we're using sort of these materials. I've written about teaching opera in prison for women's studies collection on intersectionality. So we'll bring that in. And then Joel Thompson's The 7 Last Words of the Unarmed is something that was commissioned by Eugene Rogers, an African-American, the conductor, the head of the vocal division, choral conducting program here. And he's the one who commissioned that piece. So there's a beautiful documentary that we have about him working with a very interracial, but still very white glee club, singing these last words of Eric Garner and Keith Alexander and these different men who were gunned down by the police. So I'll bring stuff in unusual ways. And I think, so it's my way of sort of bringing music into a liberal arts environment. And it's wonderful because I have Kira here, who also is doing this in the liberal arts, literature, sciences, and arts. I also want to say that I bring stuff in sort of an intersectional or a view that brings these sort of having a vantage point where you're not part of the privileged members of the academic class, or you weren't born into that, but you sort of have had to work for it. So one of my favorite classes that I teach is the history of the symphony, which very much borrows from Reinhold Brinkmann's materials. I don't know if you ever took that course, Matthew, but I've adapted it over the years. And I
did. I was just going to say, my memory of that course was I thought he was a great teacher. It was amazing how we only learned German music. And we learned the Italian double aria from Weber, because I guess he couldn't bring himself to put Rossini on the curriculum, right? It was just like it was going to be German, right? Yeah. Well, so I mean, I'm really curious to hear more about your experiences working with him as an advisor, but that's a different conversation.
That's another thing. Oh yeah, no, he just had great questions and was a quick reader and would say just enough and not too much, and didn't break the confidence down, just kept us going. His students tended to finish in a relatively reasonable amount of time. But in the symphony course, I talk about class up front, and I say this is a tradition, and I'm teaching it for non-majors, so I don't have to go into the wonderful works of Stamitz and Sammartini and the traditional where music students go, but I can start with Haydn and Mozart, and I can say this is a class. This was music that not all of Vienna was listening to. It was a court tradition and in private theaters. So this is something that is part of the inception of this genre. I talk about why don't we have women? Well, we do. We have Nannerl Mozart, we have Fanny Hensel Mendelssohn, we have Alma Mahler, we've got Clara Schumann, Clara Wieck Schumann. So there were women. It is like, as Victoria Woolf has written, about, what if Shakespeare had a sister? Well, we have composers who had sisters who went through the incredible training, and yet because of institutions, I like to bring in Linda Nochlin with women artists and she was one of the early folks who looked at this in the arts. And it's like we have these voices. Unfortunately, we don't have what they've written, but there were people who were ready to do this. So I sort of infuse these things. Who aren't we hearing? And in the symphony course, though, I want to go a little deeper into works rather than just do the whole tour bus of 900 works. So it's mainly a German, of course there's Berlioz, but the traditional symphonic canon. But at the end I bring in Missy Mazzoli with her Sinfonia orbiting spheres. And I talk about Nkiru Okoye, a Nigerian American composer who was in wrote Black Bottom for the DSO, the Detroit Symphony Orchestra. So I try along the edges. I never ignore the fact that we don't have a wider representation. But with classical music, there's so many great, wonderful goodies in the main canon. And I want everybody to be able to understand or at least begin to understand and enjoy them. So I hate it when people say, oh, let's ban Beethoven. I'm like, oh, heck no, please. I need Beethoven.
I need Beethoven in the inclusion. I mean, it's more like an addition. We're not trying to subtract anything. And, you know, like, of course, the wonderful works of Saint-Georges, which, of course, everyone knows I'm a big scholar on. And that's one of the things that I think that, you know, should be taught side by side alongside Mozart. And what was he doing in Paris? And what was he doing afterwards? And what did he take from it? You know, when they go over those things, and, you know, and soon to dub everybody the so-and-so of so-and-so, which is, you know, really quite demeaning in many ways, because how can someone be the Black Mozart when he actually influenced Mozart? Shouldn't Mozart be the white Saint-Georges? Things like that really, you know, gets my goose, as they would say.
We have a, can we move to the next question? Yeah?
We're having such a
Panelists, or do you want to say something more?
No.
Did Kira get to go on that one, or?
I didn't, but I'm also being conscious of time. I think the two things I would say really quickly would be, in addition to thinking about how to, like, ways that we can integrate music composed by people of color. I think you can also always simply, even if you do want to show that Mozart recording, like, show the Mozart recording, but show a performer of color singing it or performing it, right? So that's always, for me, like, the cheapest, dirtiest trick you can do is, I'm like, you know, if it's a Mozart aria, I find like Leontyne Price or Riri Griest or Barbara Hendricks, or you can find somebody, right, who has sung that piece and done it that way. And then the last thing I'll put in the chat in terms of things like that I've done, this is a separate project, is a website called blackcentraleurope.com, which has all kinds of primary sources on the history of Black people in Germany and Austria. It's a project I'm involved in with a bunch of other people, run in part by the German Historical Institute in Washington, DC. And we do have some stuff in there on music as well. So that's also like short little primary texts and clips and things like that are ways I integrate material into my classes. But that's a whole other conversation. Yeah.
So can I ask a question of the panelists and maybe, you know, the other people, because as we're talking about this conversation, I think of W.E.B. Du Bois, who talked about classical music in certain ways, Martin Luther King listening to Donizetti on the radio as he's driving somewhere. And so to what degree is that kind of listening to classical music simply Black people trying to live up to their white counterparts? Or is this, do we think that it's a genuine affection for this kind of thing? You know what? And I'm imagining if Du Bois is studying in Germany, I would assume that he's, you know, imbibing this from, if you will, the source. I mean, how do we talk about that we do have a long legacy? Marian Anderson, and you know, this is my cork that I like to grind. It's like, so you go to the Smithsonian Museum of, you know, African history, and all it talks about is Marian Anderson bringing spirituals. And I'm thinking, well, wait a minute. There's this whole other history that Marian Anderson represents, and that's important too. And so I mean, as Kira is saying, you know, there is a lot of Black performers doing all kinds of music, not just classical, but there is that, you know, performing and also aficionados. So how does that fit into the conversations that we have?
I mean, I guess really quickly, I feel like there are two different things that you're saying. Maybe one being how the public recognizes Black classical musicians, which is a separate conversation, versus like, how do we ourselves as individuals wrestle with this kind of aesthetic pleasure that we get from classical music? And you know, are there different historical figures who, do we take them at their word when they say that it brought them aesthetic pleasure as well? Like, recognizing the complex politics of aesthetics and aesthetic pleasure, as well as, I think, maybe I'm saying it as well, to recognize the autonomy of it. Like, is there, you know, and that is, I think, a really muddy question, but a good question, right? Is the question of like, is it ever enough to simply say, I listen to this music because it brings me aesthetic pleasure, you know? And a part of me is like, well, that in itself is a powerful statement, you know, but at the same time, I also see the sort of long history of like complex Black politics involved in that. But again, that's like a huge, I feel like it opens many cans of
We would
worms,
be here for the next 3 hours.
you know, but
Sure.
I just wanted to point out that these are, to my mind, I see these as almost like two separate but interrelated questions. The question of how the public recognizes and understands Black classical musicians, which they don't, right? Versus like, right? Versus, I think, the question of, you know, and perhaps relatedly, the unease of like, what does it mean that Marian Anderson really loved singing Schubert? Yeah.
I just, I dropped something in the chat, which is related to all this, these questions of, can Black people really love this music, you know, or is it sort of aspirational, or, and I'm just discovering in more depth, I'd heard of him, but Will Liverman is doing amazing things, and he's just getting to, I mean, he's been like at the top of his, and he's just going to keep flourishing. He recently in February just released a wonderful recording, a CD of songs by Black composers from the past as well as the present. So it's a great way to learn of new composers. But also he's known as a Figaro, Rossini's Barber of Seville Figaro. And then during the pandemic, he's following up on a project and got the Chicago Lyric Opera to support him. And he is doing this project called Factotum, which, you know, he says largo al factotum, you know, who does everything, you know, I'm doing wigs and I'm doing surgery and I'm doing matchmaking. And so he sets Barber in a Black barber shop. And it's just totally fun. And so it's a way to show that he has learned the Rossini, and he's performed it, you know, top stages, but he's also saying, I also want to do this. I want to put it in my voice, in which his voice is not going to be the same as Marlon's voice or Steve's voice or my voice or, you know, there's no one Black voice, but he's using a lot of Black singers and Latina singers and a lot of different styles. And it's wonderful. It's not out yet, but this is an 18-minute clip of the making of it. And so you get little incipits of it. So, oh my gosh, it's so much fun. I just watched it. So yes, I think we can do everything, you know, rather than falling into, ooh, Black people are so rhythmic and so musical. It's like, oh, we are part of the human race who is super musical, and we eat from so many different musical tables, so to speak. There's not just one style, but I think, I hate making generalizations, but we see this a lot in art music, classical Black composers, that they're able to infuse so many different styles, and they can be comfortable in a Broadway pit, working for Will Marion Cook, like William Grant Still, and they can be writing symphonies and operas. So there's this sort of multilingual element which is there, which is, if we don't know this, then we're not getting the full tapestry of what American music really is.
Pigeonholes are for pigeons, not people.
That's such a good answer. Coming from a Latinx person who was trained in classical music, me, and then switched over to ethnomusicology and the study of Latin American popular music, I'm curious to know, like, how do you see classical music in relationship to other types of music as field for current American music students to study? Or have you seen that relationship change or changing in the current climate?
Well, I'll just jump in really quickly since I just spoke, but back in the dark ages when I was at Barnard, and it's the same music department as Columbia, I got there in the fall of 1985, and they were just beginning to teach jazz. And it was really like, you know, should we do this? It really shouldn't be in our curriculum. So I think we are seeing huge changes now. So yeah, and I just wanted to bring that to the table because that's in my living memory. So it's in other people's memories of, wait a minute, we remember when jazz wasn't even fully an art music.
this question of classical music in relation to other fields for, I think, because I was involved in a conversation with Naomi about a month ago at a different institution. And one thing that came up, which was helpful, was just recognizing that like the issue to my mind, at least, or one of the takeaways for me was, the issue to my mind isn't that there's such a thing as canons, like all genres of music have their canons. But the problem is in recognizing the ways in which like classical music, quote unquote, is considered the canon to beat out the other canons, right? And so that becomes then perhaps the issue to rectify or to figure out, okay, how can we do a better job of putting this canon in conversation with other canons and not somehow assume the supremacy of this canon over other canons, if that makes sense. Yeah.
And I think, so, part of the challenge for some of us, you've heard that for the three of us, in some ways, we grew up loving classical music. And so it becomes doubly awkward if there are white people asking us, why don't you do jazz? And if there are Black people asking us why you don't do jazz. So, so there is that challenge. Angelina, maybe part of the answer also is that there has to be some turnover in the academy so people who are not trained or did not grow up with certain kinds of music, they can come in. And so I'm going to show you something. Those of you who know me know I collect Doc Martens. So this is one of my pairs of Doc Martens, Fear of a Black Planet. And when I got it, I thought, I don't know that album. And so, I'm old school. You mentioned, CD, Naomi. And I listened to that and I'm thinking, I know some hip hop and other rap. And I'm like, oh my God, I'm like, why didn't I know this work? I think, Naomi, you mentioned something about, hearing Schoenberg for the first time. When I heard Le Marteau sans Maître, it just knocked me off my pins. When I heard this, when I heard Stan, there are certain pieces you hear and it's like, oh my gosh, that's just amazing music. And so, some of it we don't have, those of us trained in certain ways don't have the tools to talk about it as deeply as we would like to. But there are other people coming along behind us, alongside us, and even some in front of us. One of the things that was fascinating to me, ending up doing a Sondheim dissertation, was what ended up happening. And Larry Stempel, I don't know if you're still here, but hi if you are. What ended up happening was that some folks came out of the woodwork. They wanted to talk about Broadway, but they didn't know they had the permission to do so. And so Ray Knapp at UCLA and Walter Frisch at Columbia all of a sudden work on musical theater when that was part of what they would have done had not somebody been courageous or stupid enough to do that. And so I think the person doing the incredible work on Public Enemy or Eminem, I can never say his name right. Slim Shady, yeah, there you go. Easy for you to say. Doing that work, these are the people who are changing the field. And so it will become part and parcel of what gets taught.
Well, that sort of, bring us to what kind of, you've talked about it a little bit, but what kind of changes, that's some of the things that you've witnessed in I guess in music, but what about in musicology as far as, teaching and things like that? And, how does musicology in this sense deal with race and the challenges, and most important, how do you surmount those difficulties and those challenges?
So you say, I'm the president of the American Musicological Society. You said that, Marlon, and all of a sudden I hear, I can't remember her last name. Althea was her first name. She was a Black woman in my high school years. The competing high school did The Sound of Music. She was the Mother Superior. So I hear her voice whenever I hear Climb Every Mountain. And one of the embarrassing things is for that production, they got, they found 7 white kids. They couldn't go so far as to have some of the Von Trapps be anything other than blonde and white. But they had no trouble having Althea be the Mother Superior because she had the superior voice. It was just, It was phenomenal. So Marlon, that was a song that came into my mind. How do you surpass, or how do you overcome? You climb every mountain. You ford every stream. You follow every rainbow till you find your dream. Sorry, Oscar Hammerstein is kind of cheesy, but okay, you have a follow-up on that, Marlon.
Yes, no, but specifically you personally in your teaching. I mean, I know, of course, I'm dealing with the same issues, and I come, with the same kind of mountains to climb and things like that in my profession, being what I am, a Black male conductor. But I'm thinking about more so teaching, because as I do teach at like Fordham and things like that, how I infuse things is like I have more works by women. I have more works by Black composers that I'm introducing that the kids have never heard, that I'm infusing into my teaching ever so subtly. But how do you go about doing it? I mean, you just can't say, hey, now I know that I'm Black, so I'm going to teach you all about Blackness and composers and musicology right now. But no, I kind of subtly put it in there, but I'm just wondering, what do? You add composers to your curriculum? How do you go about doing it?
So this is back to the question of education, and not
Yes.
necessarily the question about like changes that we've witnessed in musicology.
Yeah, but the change that you personally, I would say, have made or making, and you see perhaps even others like we have two of your colleagues here making,
Right. I mean, I do feel like these are, to a certain extent, of course, interrelated, but also different. One is a question about teaching and pedagogy, and another question is about research to a certain extent. And of course, research influences teaching and pedagogy, but that also, right. Yeah, I'm just clarifying the sort of order of things.
Yes.
If that makes sense. Steve, do you want to go? Yeah.
But I don't. But I mean, you're saying the research, and all of a sudden, I'm thinking about our colleague Doug Shadle, who's been doing a lot of work on Florence Price. Doug is a white guy, and so meanwhile, I just taught my opera class, as I mentioned, and I had some of my students watch Porgy and Bess to write on their report saying they had no idea that George Gershwin wasn't Black. And so all these things, and think of how many people are going to grow up thinking that George Washington and Thomas Jefferson are Black because they know Hamilton. And so, these what's that long face for, Kira?
I hope not.
Let me put my mute on for a sec.
But I think Kira's comment about it's not so. I don't even like. Sorry, I use that word to introduce something subtly. It's like our students. At least, I don't completely believe in contagion, but my students seem to want authenticity. And so if I authentically give them things and say, this is amazing. So when I give them Kathleen Kim singing, Olympia's song from Le Conte d'Hoffmann, and then it's like, oh, wait a minute. Maybe my Asian students will discover something. It really, when, Lawrence Brownlee sings Ama Viva and the aria at the end of Barbieri, which you watch Isabel Leonard watching him sing this, and she's like, I can't believe I'm on the stage with this guy pulling this thing off this late in the show. And so, and just to, talk about that, and, it's not so much subtle, it's just like, this is the world. This is our world, and, welcome to it. And I think, students, white, Black, all colors, appreciate seeing that they belong in this world, and they, at the highest levels.
I'm conscious of the time. Where I don't mind. I don't want to abuse your time. I don't mind going a few minutes over. We sort of have. We have really two. Some of the audience questions have really been answered already, I would say. So maybe I would ask just one that is sort of related to the last thing we were talking about, and sort of the one that hasn't been answered. That didn't come up later in the conversation after it was asked by the audience, which has to do with, and again, it might tie back into where we were going with the musicology question, because you're not opera company directors and running symphonies, but one of the audience questions was about how to try to get works by Florence Price, William Grant Still into opera repertoire into symphonic repertoire, into performing repertoire. And that might, I guess that could tie back to that last question about sort of what is musicology's role in that, because obviously we don't direct, we're not the people picking repertoire for a season, but that might be a good place to end. That audience.
So when Naomi, you were talking about introducing class and all, I was thinking, one of the pieces of scholarship that really shook my pins, and I hope it hasn't been knocked down as not right, is Julia Moore's work on Beethoven's late quartets, where we discovered that the reason why Beethoven wrote them, he wrote his bagatelles, and his publisher says, I can sell bagatelles, but you just wrote the Ninth Symphony. It's easier for me to sell things that are complex. It's like, you want complex? I'll write these things. And so there's a lot of music that gets written, gets performed, that's all around economics. And that's something I try and bring into my class a lot. So the unfortunate answer, one of the unfortunate answers about the question, how do we get these things? It becomes, where is the money to make those things happen? And so where is the money to produce an opera, which is going to be millions of dollars? And where, that's not to say that the money shouldn't be there. It's like, let's write to Oprah or some other folks to say, hey, let's get behind this kind of project. But again, I worry if it becomes one and done, as opposed to something more integral into the whole nature. And so that's where we all need to play a part in that. Naomi, go.
I can jump in quickly and say that I've been very fortunate to have a connection with the Seattle Opera as their inaugural scholar in residence, and I've been asked to be involved with more events with opera companies. And so I would like to say something that might sound really weird, but again, I'm, somebody who sits in the audience, I teach, and sort of this is a new world into the actual sort of interworkings of these professional companies. You can write to them. You can write to, and you can do it strategically. You can sort of go to their website. I know opera the best, so I'll talk about that. Go to the website, see who is the sort of the general director, who is the chairman of the board, so you don't have to write to everybody, but you can write to strategic people and say, I really want to hear more. Well, Florence Price she has vocal works, but not operas, but I really want to hear new work. I want to hear more Anthony Davis and or other people who are writing, Black composers writing opera. Please look, Michigan Opera Theater is going to do it. And I think it's co-sponsored with Opera Omaha. And we've got Chicago Lyric is doing this Factotum project. I want this in Atlanta, or I want this in Cincinnati. And I mentioned those two companies because they've got a lot of Black folks living there, but they're also very open to hearing these things. There are a lot of companies, particularly after last summer, who want to know, what will we sell tickets for? How can we do this? So it might sound sort of simple, but as I'm doing more work behind the scenes, nobody writes. Or not many people do, and some weirdos write, but you guys are not weirdos. And you can say, I want more of this.
We
and
are.
I'll buy a ticket. We're good weirdos, not like the creepy ones.
What I still love about Naomi's suggestion is it's putting public pressure, right? Because a lot of it is thinking about where can we apply public pressure to change things. I think that's just such a really smart, such a great way to think about it. I don't know how much more I think I have to add to that conversation, other than also saying that, please also, of course, think about ways in which you can support Black institutions right now of classical music, from Castle of Our Skins to Sphinx to, Gateways Music Festival to all of these different opportunities, that are there, and Decomposed I love a lot right now, so I feel like there's actually so much more out there than perhaps people might know about, but to my mind, there's just a really exciting, vibrant kind of scene these days that people can tap into.
Great. I feel like we should bring this to a close because we're technically a little bit over time, but I want to thank you so much for just a really wonderful, stimulating conversation. And I thank you for your honesty and your interesting interchanges with each other as well, and the very different viewpoints. So thank you all so much for being a part of this.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You.
Oh, thank you. Such a pleasure.